Hello and welcome to another gentle descent into the past. Tonight, we'll open the doors to a world once lost, now rediscovered through quiet storytelling. Perhaps you're lying still beneath the covers or letting the last hours of the day melt away. Either way, I'm honored to have you here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Are we continents apart? We're just a few time zones away, both listening as the stars come out. If you enjoy resting to soft-spoken tales and thoughtful history, be sure to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover together. The medieval mind approached law differently than we do today. Where we seek consistency and precedent, they often relied on tradition, divine judgment, and what we might charitably call creative problem-solving. Laws were not merely rules to be followed, but reflections of deeply held beliefs about morality, social order, and the very nature of truth itself. Consider the peculiar case of animal trials, a legal tradition that flourished across medieval Europe for several centuries. Yes, you heard correctly. Animals could be put on trial, complete with legal representation, formal proceedings, and even appeals. In 1386, a pig in Fête, France, was tried and executed for killing an infant. The pig was dressed in human clothing for the execution, as if to emphasize its moral culpability. This was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader legal framework that held animals accountable for their actions in ways that seem almost fantastical to us now. These animal trials were not mere curiosities, but reflected deep-seated beliefs about justice and moral order. Medieval people believed that all of creation was bound by divine law, and when that law was broken, even by a beast, justice demanded satisfaction. Pigs that killed children, bulls that gored farmers, and even insects that destroyed crops could find themselves defendants in formal legal proceedings. The legal representation provided to these animal defendants was often surprisingly thorough. In 1750, a female donkey was tried for bestiality alongside her human accomplice in France. The donkey's defense attorney argued successfully that she had been an unwilling participant, and she was acquitted while the man was executed. Witnesses even testified to the donkey's good character and previous virtuous behavior. But animals were not the only unexpected defendants in medieval courts. Inanimate objects, too, could find themselves on trial. If a sword killed someone, the weapon itself might be tried and banished from the realm. Bells that had rung during violent storms were sometimes put on trial for their role in summoning destructive weather. Trees that had fallen and killed passers-by could be formally prosecuted and sentenced to be cut down and removed. These object trials reflected a world-view where the boundaries between the animate and inanimate, the moral and amoral, were far more fluid than our modern understanding would suggest. Every element of creation was seen as part of a grand moral order. And when that order was disrupted, the law stepped in to restore balance. The concept of trial by ordeal added another layer of strangeness to medieval justice. These were legal procedures designed to determine guilt or innocence through divine intervention. The underlying belief was that God would not allow an innocent person to suffer harm during these tests, making them a form of supernatural lie detector. Trial by hot iron was one such ordeal. The accused would be required to carry a piece of red-hot iron for a specified distance, usually 9 paces. Their hand would then be bandaged and examined after 3 days. If the wound was healing cleanly, they were declared innocent. If it showed signs of infection or poor healing, guilt was assumed. Trial by cold water involved throwing the accused into a body of water while bound. If they floated, they were considered guilty as the pure water was rejecting them. If they sank and drowned, they were posthumously declared innocent. This presented what we might call a significant design flaw in the justice system, as innocence could only be proven through death. Perhaps most dramatically, trial by combat allowed disputes to be settled through physical battle. This could involve the actual disputants fighting each other, or they could hire champions to fight on their behalf. The belief was that God would ensure victory for the righteous party. Interestingly, this practice was not limited to men. Women, clergy, and the elderly could all demand trial by combat, though they typically employed champions rather than fighting personally. The legal status of various professions in medieval Europe also produced some wonderfully strange laws. Executioners, for instance, occupied a peculiar position in society. While their services were essential for the functioning of the justice system, they were often considered ritually unclean and were subjected to numerous restrictions. In many German states, executioners were required to live outside town walls and could only enter the town to perform their duties. They were forbidden from touching food in markets, as their touch was believed to contaminate goods. Interestingly, executioners often supplemented their income by working as healers and veterinarians. Their intimate knowledge of anatomy gained through their primary profession made them surprisingly effective medical practitioners. This created the paradoxical situation where the same person might take a life in the morning and save one in the afternoon. The legal treatment of debt in medieval Europe produced some particularly inventive solutions. In parts of medieval France, a debtor who could not pay might be required to sit naked in the town square while crying out their shame to all who passed. This public humiliation was designed both as punishment and as a way to encourage charitable contributions from passers-by. Some regions developed the concept of debt inheritance in ways that seem almost surreal today. In certain parts of medieval Germany, unpaid debts could be inherited by the debtor's children, but only if they had been present when the debt was incurred. This led to the strange practice of excluding children from important financial discussions to protect them from future liability. The regulation of markets and trade produced its own category of unusual laws. In medieval London, the punishment for selling bad food was often poetic justice taken to extremes. Bakers who sold underweight bread might be dragged through the streets on a hurdle with the offending loaf hung around their necks. Brewers who watered down their ale could be forced to drink only their own inferior product for a specified period. The medieval understanding of property rights also led to some fascinating legal concepts. The doctrine of treasure trove held that any valuable object found buried in the ground belonged to the crown based on the assumption that it had been hidden with the intention of retrieval. However, if the treasure was found above ground, it belonged to the finder, leading to complex legal debates about exactly what constituted buried versus merely hidden. These strange laws were not merely the products of backward thinking or primitive legal understanding. They reflected sophisticated attempts to maintain social order in a world very different from our own. Medieval society faced challenges we can barely imagine. Constant warfare, devastating plagues, economic uncertainty, and the ever-present threat of famine. In such a world, laws needed to be more than mere rules. They needed to be mechanisms for preserving the delicate balance that kept communities together. The apparent strangeness of these laws often dissolves when we understand the context in which they operated. What seems bizarre to us made perfect sense to people living in a world where divine judgment was a daily reality, where community harmony was essential for survival, and where justice needed to be both seen and felt by all members of society. As we drift deeper into the medieval world, we begin to see that these strange laws were threads in a complex tapestry of belief, tradition, and practical necessity. They tell us not just about legal systems, but about entire ways of understanding the world, human nature, and our place in the grand scheme of creation. In our next exploration, we will delve deeper into the curious world of medieval marriage laws, where love, politics, and legal ingenuity combined to create some of the most fascinating and bewildering regulations in European history. But for now, let the strange and wonderful world of medieval justice settle gently in your mind as you drift toward peaceful sleep. The medieval world was one of stark contrasts when it came to food. While kings and nobles feasted on elaborate banquets with exotic spices and multiple courses, the vast majority of people lived on the edge of starvation, their meals consisting of little more than coarse bread and thin gaar ale. This disparity wasn't merely about wealth. It was a reflection of an entire social system built on inequality. For the common peasant, meat was an extraordinary luxury. A family might keep a pig or a few chickens, but these animals were far too valuable to slaughter regularly. Instead, they provided eggs, milk, and the occasional offspring that could be sold for much-needed coin. When meat did appear on the peasant table, it was usually during religious festivals or when an animal was too old or sick to serve any other purpose. Even then, every scrap was used from organ meats to blood puddings, as nothing could be wasted in a world where the next meal was never guaranteed. The preservation of food presented another monumental challenge. Without refrigeration, medieval people had to rely on salting, smoking, drying, and fermentation to keep their food from spoiling. Salt itself was expensive and often of poor quality, filled with impurities that could make preserved meats taste terrible or even cause illness. Fish were packed in barrels with heavy salt, creating a product that bore little resemblance to fresh seafood. Vegetables were pickled in vinegar or fermented into sauerkraut, while fruits were dried into leathery strips that could last through the winter months. But perhaps the most insidious problem was the widespread adulteration of food. Unscrupulous merchants and bakers driven by poverty and desperation regularly cut corners to maximize their profits. Bread, the staple of the medieval diet, was often stretched with sawdust, chalk, grounder corns, or even bone meal. These additives not only made the bread less nutritious, but could also be dangerous to consume. Similarly, ale and wine were frequently watered down, leaving consumers with weak, unpalatable drinks that provided little refreshment or nutrition. The story of Agnes, a fictional but representative alewife, illustrates these challenges perfectly. Struggling to support her family after her husband's death, Agnes found herself faced with rising grain prices and dwindling customers, desperate to make her ale last longer and increase her profits. She began watering down her brew. At first, the deception went unnoticed, but word soon spread about the weak, tasteless ale. Her once loyal customers began seeking other establishments, and Agnes's reputation was ruined. Eventually, she was forced to close her business, leaving her family in even more desperate circumstances. The authorities did attempt to regulate food quality through laws like the Assay of bread and ale, which set standards for weight, price, and quality. Violators could face fines, public humiliation in the pillory, or even corporal punishment. In some cases, dishonest bakers were dragged through the streets with their substandard loaves hung around their necks as a warning to others. However, enforcement was inconsistent and often ineffective as the underlying economic pressures that drove people to adulterate their products remained unchanged. The lack of variety in the medieval diet was another source of suffering. While we today can enjoy fruits and vegetables from around the world year-round, medieval people were entirely dependent on what could be grown locally and what was in season. For most of the year, peasants subsisted on a monotonous diet of porridge made from barley, oats, or rye, accompanied by whatever vegetables they could grow in their small garden plots. Onions, leeks, and cabbages were among the hardiest crops, but these provided little in the way of essential vitamins and minerals. The seasonal nature of food availability meant that late winter and early spring were particularly difficult times. By then, the previous year's harvest would be running low, and the new crops had not yet matured. This period, known as the Hunger Gap, was when malnutrition was most severe and death rates highest. Children born during these lean months often suffered from stunted growth and weakened immune systems that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Spices, which we now take for granted, were among the most precious commodities in medieval Europe. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg had to be transported over vast distances along dangerous trade routes, making them extraordinarily expensive. A pound of nutmeg in the 11th century could cost as much as 7 oxen, putting it far beyond the reach of ordinary people. For the wealthy, spices were not just flavoring agents, but symbols of status and power, displayed as prominently as jewels or fine clothing. The contrast between rich and poor was perhaps nowhere more evident than in the royal feast. These elaborate affairs were designed not just to feed the nobility, but to demonstrate their wealth and power. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted peacocks, swans, and other exotic birds, their feathers carefully replaced after cooking to create stunning visual displays. Sugar sculptures called subtleties depicted scenes from mythology or heraldic symbols, while servants paraded dishes through the hall with great ceremony. Yet even these magnificent feasts came with their own dangers. Without understanding of food safety, even the wealthy were vulnerable to food poisoning and other ailments. The death of King John of England in 1216, attributed to consuming spoiled peaches, serves as a reminder that in the medieval world, every meal was potentially hazardous. The king had been traveling through the countryside when he stopped at an abbey and indulged in what he thought was a harmless treat. Within days, he was dead from what modern historians believe was severe food poisoning. The unsanitary conditions of medieval life compounded these food safety issues. Peasant families often shared their single-room dwellings with their livestock as the animals provided warmth during the cold winter months. However, this arrangement meant that animal waste, insects, and vermin were constant presences in the home. Food was prepared and consumed in these same spaces with contamination, almost inevitable. In medieval cities, the situation was even worse. Narrow, winding streets were filled with garbage, human waste, and the refuse from various trades and industries. The lack of proper sewage systems meant that waste often contaminated water sources, making even drinking water dangerous. The Tempames in London, for example, served simultaneously as the city's primary water source and its main sewer, a situation that contributed to frequent outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases. The Catholic Church added another layer of complexity to medieval food culture through its extensive fasting requirements. During Lent, the 40-day period before Easter, the faithful were expected to abstain from meat, dairy products, and eggs. For the wealthy, this meant substituting fish and other alternatives, but for the poor, it often meant simply going without. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays were also designated as meatless days throughout the year, further restricting an already limited diet. While the Church's intentions may have been spiritual, the practical effect of these restrictions was often to worsen the nutritional status of people who were already malnourished. The story of John and Matilda, a fictional peasant couple, illustrates this dilemma. With 3 children to feed and only a small plot of land, they struggled to provide adequate nutrition even in the best of times. During Lent, they were expected to give up the small amounts of preserved meat and dairy that provided crucial protein and calories. As the days wore on, their children grew weak and listless, crying constantly from hunger. John, a devout man, wrestled with his faith as he watched his family suffer, while Matilda secretly dreamed of the hearty stew she would make when the fast finally ended. Not all of the Church's influence on food was negative. However, monasteries and abbeys with their extensive landholdings and well-organized communities often served as centers of agricultural innovation. Monks pioneered new techniques in crop rotation, irrigation, and animal husbandry that gradually improved food production. They also served as sources of charity, distributing bread and ale to the hungry and providing shelter for travelers and pilgrims. The story of Saint Hildegard of Bingen exemplifies the positive aspects of the Church's relationship with food. Born into a noble family in 12th century Germany, Hildegard became an abbess and was renowned for her knowledge of herbal medicine and nutrition. She wrote extensively about the properties of different grains and foods, advocating for spelt as a healthier alternative to common wheat. Under her guidance, the nuns at her abbey produced high-quality bread that was distributed to the sick and poor in the surrounding community. Hildegard's holistic approach to nutrition, which emphasized the connection between food and health, was remarkably prescient and would not be fully appreciated until modern times. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 represents perhaps the darkest chapter in medieval food history. A catastrophic combination of climate change, crop failures, and political instability plunged much of Europe into 7 years of starvation and misery. Contemporary chronicles paint a horrifying picture of the suffering endured by ordinary people. The Flemish chronicler William of Nangis wrote that men ate dogs, horses, cats, and other unclean things, while other accounts describe people resorting to cannibalism in their desperation. The famine hit different regions with varying severity, but nowhere was spared entirely. In some areas of the Low Countries and Scandinavia, mortality rates reached 10 to 25% of the population. The German city of Erfurt saw an average of 16 deaths per day during the worst years compared to just 2 per day in normal times. The psychological impact of the famine was as devastating as the physical toll, creating a generation scarred by the memory of extreme hunger and loss. Even in normal times, the threat of food scarcity was never far away. A single failed harvest could spell disaster for entire communities, and peasant families lived in constant fear of the next crisis. This precarious existence shaped every aspect of medieval life. From marriage and family planning to religious beliefs and social structures, people developed elaborate strategies for coping with scarcity. From complex systems of mutual aid to detailed knowledge of wild plants and alternative food sources, the contrast between medieval food culture and our modern abundance is striking. Today, we can walk into a supermarket and find fruits from South America, spices from Asia, and vegetables from around the world, all neatly packaged and ready to eat. We have access to a variety of foods that would have been unimaginable to even the wealthiest medieval nobles. Our understanding of nutrition, food safety, and preservation has transformed eating from a daily struggle into a source of pleasure and nourishment. Yet, this abundance comes with its own challenges. We grapple with issues of food waste, environmental sustainability, and dietary-related health problems that were unknown in the medieval world. The global food system that provides us with such variety also creates new forms of inequality and environmental degradation. Perhaps there are lessons to be learned from our medieval ancestors about the value of local seasonal eating and the importance of not taking food for granted. The story of medieval food is ultimately a story of human resilience and ingenuity in the face of enormous challenges. Despite the constant threats of hunger, disease, and adulteration, people found ways to survive and even create moments of joy and celebration around food. They developed preservation techniques that are still used today, created dishes that evolved into modern cuisines, and established traditions of hospitality and sharing that continue to shape our culture. As we reflect on this distant past, we gain a deeper appreciation for the progress we have made and the privileges we enjoy. The simple act of opening a refrigerator or visiting a grocery store represents centuries of advancement in agriculture, technology, and social organization. At the same time, the medieval experience reminds us of our fundamental dependence on food and the importance of ensuring that everyone has access to adequate nutrition. The legacy of medieval food culture lives on in many ways. Traditional preservation methods like smoking and fermentation have experienced a renaissance among modern cooks seeking authentic flavors and sustainable practices. The seasonal rhythms that once dictated medieval diets are being rediscovered by those promoting local and sustainable agriculture. Even the elaborate feasts of the nobility have their modern counterparts in the fine dining establishments that turn meals into theatrical experiences. Perhaps most importantly, the medieval experience teaches us about the deep connections between food, community, and survival. In a world where hunger was a constant threat, sharing food became one of the most fundamental expressions of human compassion and solidarity. The communal meals that marked religious festivals and life transitions were not just celebrations, but affirmations of social bonds and mutual support. As we drift off to sleep in our modern world of abundance, we can remember the countless generations who struggled to fill their bellies with whatever meager sustenance they could find. Their perseverance in the face of such hardship reminds us of the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of gratitude for the simple blessings we often take for granted. In honoring their memory, we commit ourselves to building a world where no one needs suffer the pangs of hunger that define so much of human history. As the candlelit shadows danced across the stone walls of medieval castles, a stark culinary divide defined the era. While nobles feasted on exotic delicacies and sumptuous banquets, the vast majority of medieval Europeans faced a daily struggle for sustenance that would horrify modern sensibilities. The scarcity of spices created one of the most glaring differences between rich and poor. While a pound of nutmeg in the 11th century cost as much as 7 fattened oxen, peasants made do with whatever meager seasonings they could find. Garlic, mustard, and vinegar became their primary weapons against the relentless blandness of their daily fare. The absence of reliable preservation methods meant fresh produce remained seasonal luxuries, leaving most to subsist on monotonous grains and whatever hardy vegetables could survive the harsh climate. Meat consumption revealed perhaps the starkest inequality. A prosperous peasant family might slaughter their pig only once a year, usually at Christmas, while nobles gorged themselves on elaborate dishes featuring exotic game. When meat did grace the peasant table, it often came in forms that would turn modern stomachs, organ meats, blood puddings, and cuts from animals too old or sick for other purposes. Fish offered some relief for those near water sources, but even this was typically preserved through heavy salting, creating a far cry from the delicate preparations we know today. The Church's influence permeated every aspect of medieval food culture, often compounding the hardships faced by the poor. Lent's 40-day fast meant giving up what little meat and dairy peasants possessed, while wealthy nobles could afford exotic substitutes. The story of Agnes Paston, brought before a memorial court in 1322 for stealing bread during Lent to feed her starving children, illustrates the cruel irony of religious dietary restrictions imposed on those already living at the edge of starvation. Food adulteration ran rampant in an era without regulations or quality control. Unscrupulous bakers stretched their precious flour with sawdust, chalk, or ground acorns, creating dense, gritty loaves that provided little nutrition. Alewives watered down their brews to increase profits, leaving customers with weak, unsatisfying drinks that barely qualified as beverages. The Assay of Bread and Ale attempted to regulate these practices, but enforcement remained sporadic at best. Unsanitary conditions made every meal a potential hazard. Peasant families shared their cramped quarters with livestock, creating breeding grounds for disease and contamination. Animal waste mingled with food preparation areas, while flies and vermin spread filth throughout living spaces. Even kings weren't immune. King John of England's death in 1216, attributed to consuming spoiled peaches, demonstrated that contaminated food could fell rulers as easily as peasants. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 revealed the precarious nature of medieval food security. 7 years of crop failures plunged Europe into starvation so severe that chroniclers reported cannibalism and people eating grass, bark, and even their own children. Mortality rates reached 25% in some regions, with cities like Earth averaging 16 deaths per day compared to 2 in normal times. Despite these overwhelming challenges, medieval people demonstrated remarkable resilience and ingenuity. They developed sophisticated preservation techniques through salting, smoking, and fermentation. Women who bore primary responsibility for feeding their families created folk traditions of pickling and foraging that sustained communities through lean times. Monasteries served as centers of agricultural innovation and charitable food distribution, offering some relief to the desperate. The rare medieval feast provided a stunning contrast to daily reality. Royal banquets featured dozens of elaborate dishes, roasted peacocks, sugar sculptures, and delicacies flavored with precious spices. These displays of culinary opulence served not just as entertainment, but as powerful demonstrations of wealth and status, reminding all present of the vast gulf between the privileged few and the struggling masses. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval people found ways to create meaning and community around food despite its scarcity. Harvest festivals brought villages together in celebration of successful crops. Wedding feasts, however modest, marked life's milestones with shared meals. Even the humblest pottage became an opportunity for families to gather around the hearth, telling stories and maintaining bonds that sustained them through hardship. The legacy of medieval food culture reminds us of both human vulnerability and resilience. In an age where we can access flavors from around the globe with unprecedented ease and safety, it's worth remembering those who found joy and sustenance in the simplest of meals. Their struggles and ingenuity laid the foundations for the abundance we now enjoy, teaching us never to take for granted the basic human right to nourishment and the profound satisfaction of sharing food with those we love. As we drift off to sleep with full bellies and endless choices at our fingertips, we can honor their memory by appreciating the remarkable journey that brought us from medieval scarcity to modern plenty. In every bite we take, we taste the hard-won progress of countless generations who transformed necessity into the art of cuisine, ensuring that future generations might know abundance where they knew only want. Looking at your reference videos and existing script, I'll continue from where Part 3 left off, maintaining the sleep-inducing tone while exploring the harsh realities of medieval European law and society. As we've seen, the world of medieval Europe was one where even the most basic human needs were fraught with difficulty and danger. Food was scarce, often contaminated, and subject to the whims of weather and war. But perhaps even more challenging than securing one's next meal was navigating the complex and often brutal system of justice that governed daily life. The laws of medieval Europe were a patchwork of traditions, customs, and edicts that varied dramatically from one region to another, creating a landscape where justice was anything but certain. In the flickering candlelight of a medieval courthouse, imagine the tension as an accused thief stands before a panel of judges. The evidence against him is circumstantial at best. Yet the consequences of a guilty verdict could mean the loss of a hand, an eye, or even his life. This was not a world of careful deliberation and reasoned argument, but one where justice was swift, harsh, and often arbitrary. The legal systems that governed medieval Europe were designed not so much to determine guilt or innocence, but to maintain order through fear and to reinforce the rigid social hierarchies that kept peasants in their place and nobles in power. The foundation of medieval law rested upon a complex web of feudal obligations and customary practices that had evolved over centuries. At the heart of this system was the concept of personal loyalty and mutual obligation between lord and vassal. A peasant owed service to his lord not merely as a tenant, but as a bound serf, whose very existence was tied to the land he worked. In return, the lord was expected to provide protection and justice, though these protections were often more theoretical than real. The lord's court was typically held in the great hall of his manor, where he would sit in judgment over disputes between his tenants, crimes committed within his domain, and violations of the countless regulations that govern peasant life. These memorial courts dealt with a bewildering array of offenses, from the trivial to the serious. A peasant might find himself hauled before his lord for allowing his pigs to wander into a neighbor's garden, for failing to attend the required number of days of labor service, or for the serious crime of attempting to leave the manor without permission. The punishments were often brutal and disproportionate to the crimes. A serf caught trying to flee might be branded on the forehead with a hot iron, marking him forever as a runaway. A woman accused of adultery might be forced to walk naked through the village while being pelted with stones and filth by her neighbors. The concept of individual rights as we understand them today was virtually non-existent in medieval legal thinking. Justice was not about protecting the innocent or ensuring fair treatment, but about maintaining social order and reinforcing the authority of those in power. The idea that all people might be equal before the law would have been laughable to a medieval lord who saw himself as inherently superior to the peasants who worked his land. The law existed to serve the interests of the ruling class, and any benefits that might trickle down to the common people were incidental at best. Perhaps nowhere was this inequality more apparent than in the realm of criminal justice. When a crime was committed, the response of the authorities depended heavily on the social status of both the perpetrator and the victim. If a peasant stole a loaf of bread from a nobleman's table, he might face hanging or mutilation. But if a nobleman killed a peasant in a fit of rage, he might escape with nothing more than a fine paid to the victim's family. The wealthy could often purchase their way out of legal troubles through bribes, political connections, or by claiming benefit of clergy, a legal loophole that allowed those who could read Latin to be tried in ecclesiastical rather than secular courts, where punishments were typically less severe. The process of determining guilt or innocence in medieval courts often bore little resemblance to modern concepts of justice. Evidence as we understand it today was rarely considered decisive. Instead, medieval justice relied heavily on supernatural intervention and divine judgment to reveal the truth. This belief in divine justice gave rise to some of the most bizarre and brutal practices in the history of law. Procedures that seem almost incomprehensible to modern minds, but were accepted as perfectly reasonable by medieval people who believed that God would not allow an innocent person to suffer unjustly. Trial by ordeal was one such practice based on the assumption that divine intervention would protect the innocent while revealing the guilt of the wicked. There were several forms of ordeal, each more harrowing than the last. In the ordeal of hot iron, the accused would be required to carry a red-hot piece of metal for a prescribed distance, usually 9 paces. Their hand would then be bandaged and examined 3 days later. If the wound was healing cleanly, they were declared innocent. If it showed signs of infection or festering, they were judged guilty and punished accordingly. The ordeal of hot water required the accused to plunge their hand into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a stone or ring. As with the hot iron, the condition of the hand after 3 days would determine their fate. For those accused of particularly serious crimes, there was the ordeal of cold water, which operated on the opposite principle. The accused would be bound and thrown into a body of water, typically a pond or river that had been blessed by a priest. If they sank, they were considered innocent, as the pure water had accepted them. If they floated, they were deemed guilty, as the water had rejected their corrupted soul. Either way, the accused faced a grim prospect, drowning if innocent or surviving only to face execution if guilty. The logic of this system was based on medieval understanding of the natural world, where it was believed that water, being pure and holy, would naturally reject anything evil or corrupted. These orals were not administered lightly or without ceremony. They were elaborate rituals that often took place in churches or other sacred spaces, with priests presiding over the proceedings and blessing the instruments of trial. The accused would typically be required to fast for several days beforehand and to attend special masses to purify their soul before facing divine judgment. The entire community would often gather to witness these spectacles, which served not only as a means of determining guilt, but as powerful demonstrations of divine power and earthly authority. The psychological impact of these orals cannot be overstated. Many accused individuals, believing themselves to be guilty or convinced that God would reveal their sins, would confess before undergoing the ordeal. Others, terrified by the prospect of divine judgment, would flee before the appointed day, an act that was taken as clear evidence of guilt. In some cases, the mere threat of trial by ordeal was enough to extract a confession or to resolve a dispute without the need for the actual procedure. But perhaps even more telling about medieval attitudes toward justice was the practice of trial by combat, where disputes were resolved through armed conflict between the parties involved. This practice was based on the belief that God would grant victory to the party in the right, ensuring that justice would prevail through strength of arms. Trial by combat could be invoked for a wide range of disputes, from accusations of treason and murder to disagreements over property rights and commercial contracts. The combatants would fight with weapons appropriate to their social status. Nobles might use swords and shields, while commoners might be armed with clubs or staffs. The rules governing trial by combat were surprisingly elaborate and formal. The fight would take place in a designated area, often a field outside the town walls, with strict boundaries marked out to prevent either combatant from fleeing. Officials would oversee the proceedings to ensure that the combat was conducted fairly, though what constituted fairness in a system based on mortal combat was itself questionable. The fight would continue until one party was killed, severely wounded, or surrendered by crying out for mercy. Victory was taken as clear evidence of divine favor and thus of the righteousness of the winner's cause. For those unable to fight for themselves due to age, disability, or gender, the system allowed for the appointment of champions who would fight on their behalf. This created a class of professional fighters who made their living by serving as champions in legal disputes. These men were often skilled warriors who would fight for whoever could afford their services, regardless of the merits of the case. The wealthy could hire the best champions, while the poor were left to find whatever representation they could afford, or to fight for themselves against potentially superior opponents. Women, being generally barred from combat, faced particular challenges in a system that relied so heavily on physical prowess to determine justice. They could appoint male champions to fight for them, but this put them at the mercy of men who might not be entirely committed to their cause. In some cases, women were allowed to fight against male accusers, but under conditions that were heavily stacked against them. A woman accused of killing her husband, for example, might be required to fight while standing in a pit up to her waist, with one arm tied behind her back, while her male opponent fought with full mobility and weaponry. The brutality of these legal procedures extended beyond the courtroom to the punishments that were meted out to those found guilty. Medieval justice was based on the principle of retribution rather than rehabilitation, and punishments were designed to be both severe and public, serving as deterrents to others who might be tempted to break the law. The range of punishments available to medieval judges was vast and creative in its cruelty, reflecting a society that saw physical suffering as an appropriate response to moral transgression. For theft, one of the most common crimes in an age of widespread poverty, the punishments varied according to the value of the stolen goods and the social status of the thief. A peasant caught stealing food might lose a hand, making it impossible for him to work and essentially condemning him to death by starvation. A repeat offender might face hanging, while someone caught stealing from a church could be sentenced to having their eyes put out or their tongue cut off. The logic behind these punishments was that the penalty should reflect the nature of the crime. A thief lost the hand that had committed the theft. A liar lost the tongue that had spoken falsehoods, and so on. Public executions were elaborate spectacles that drew crowds from miles around, combining entertainment with moral instruction in a way that seems grotesque to modern sensibilities. The condemned would be paraded through the streets to the place of execution, often accompanied by priests who would exhort them to confess their sins and prepare for the afterlife. The methods of execution varied widely and were often chosen to reflect the severity of the crime or the social status of the condemned. Nobles might be granted the privilege of beheading, considered a quick and honorable death, while commoners faced hanging, which was seen as more degrading but equally final. For the most serious crimes, however, medieval justice demanded punishments that went far beyond simple death. Traitors might be hanged, drawn, and quartered, a process that began with the condemned being dragged through the streets on a hurdle, then hanged until nearly dead, disemboweled while still alive, and finally cut into quarters that would be displayed in prominent locations as a warning to others. Heretics and witches faced burning at the stake, a punishment that was believed to purify their souls through fire, while serving as a dramatic demonstration of the fate that awaited those who defied religious authority. Women who committed certain crimes faced punishments that reflected medieval attitudes toward gender and morality. A woman who killed her husband might be burned alive, as this crime was seen as a form of treason against the natural order that placed husbands in authority over their wives. Prostitutes might be forced to wear distinctive clothing or have their heads shaved as marks of shame, while women accused of being scolds or shrews might be subjected to the ducking stool, strapped to a chair, and repeatedly dunked in a pond or river until they promised to mend their ways. The application of these punishments was far from consistent, however, and the wealthy and well-connected often found ways to escape the full force of medieval justice. Benefit of clergy allowed those who could demonstrate literacy to claim the right to be tried in church courts where punishments were typically less severe. Sanctuary laws permitted criminals to claim protection in churches where they could remain safe from secular authorities for a prescribed period. Wealthy defendants could often negotiate compositions, monetary payments that would substitute for physical punishment, or they could simply flee to other jurisdictions where their crimes were unknown. This system of justice, brutal and arbitrary as it was, served important functions in medieval society beyond simply punishing wrongdoers. Public punishments reinforced social hierarchies by demonstrating the power of the authorities and the consequences of challenging established order. They provided a form of entertainment in a world where diversions were few and far between. Most importantly, they created a climate of fear that helped to maintain control over a population that vastly outnumbered their rulers and had little to lose by rebellion. The legal systems of medieval Europe also reflected the fragmented nature of political authority during this period. A person traveling from one region to another might find themselves subject to completely different laws and customs, creating a confusing patchwork of jurisdictions and legal traditions. Canon law derived from church teachings and papal decrees governed matters relating to marriage, morality, and religious observance. Roman law preserved in the legal codes of the ancient empire influenced the development of legal systems in many parts of Europe. Germanic tribal laws passed down through oral tradition and gradually codified governed many aspects of daily life in regions that had been settled by barbarian tribes. Local customs and traditions added another layer of complexity to this legal maze. What was considered a crime in one village might be perfectly acceptable in another. Marriage customs, property rights, and commercial practices all varied from place to place, creating endless opportunities for confusion and conflict. A merchant traveling from town to town had to be familiar with the specific laws and customs of each place he visited. As ignorance of local law was rarely accepted as an excuse for transgression, the Church played a particularly important role in medieval legal systems, not only through its own canon law, but through its influence on secular courts and its provision of educated clerks who could read and write legal documents. Many medieval laws were designed to enforce Christian morality and to support the authority of the Church. Blasphemy, heresy, and failure to attend Mass were serious crimes that could result in severe punishment. The Church's extensive landholdings and its role as a major economic and political power meant that ecclesiastical courts often had jurisdiction over matters that would be considered purely secular today. As we consider these harsh realities of medieval justice, it becomes clear that the legal systems of this period were shaped by fundamentally different assumptions about human nature, divine will, and social order than those that govern modern societies. The idea that justice should be impartial, that punishment should fit the crime, or that all people should be equal before the law were foreign concepts in a world where social hierarchy was seen as divinely ordained, and where the primary purpose of law was to maintain order rather than to protect individual rights. The legacy of these medieval legal systems can still be seen in many aspects of modern law, from the adversarial nature of court proceedings to the use of juries to determine guilt or innocence. But the evolution from the brutal and arbitrary justice of the Middle Ages to the more humane and rational legal systems of today has been a long and gradual process marked by countless struggles for reform and recognition of human dignity. As we drift deeper into sleep, let these images of medieval justice fade into the background of our consciousness. the harsh realities of life in an age where might made right, where divine judgment was sought through trial by fire and water, and where public execution served as both entertainment and moral instruction. These were the foundations upon which our modern world was built, the dark soil from which grew the ideas of human rights, due process, and equal justice under law that we now take for granted. Rest easy, knowing that while the struggles of our medieval ancestors were real and often brutal, they also laid the groundwork for the more just and humane societies we inhabit today. Their suffering was not in vain, for it taught humanity hard lessons about the importance of fairness, compassion, and the rule of law. And in their stories of endurance in the face of arbitrary power and cruel justice, we find inspiration for our own ongoing efforts to create a world where all people can live with dignity and hope. Word Count 1847. The life of a peasant in medieval Scotland was marked by the constant struggle against both human oppression and the unforgiving forces of nature. While clan warfare raged overhead and English armies periodically swept across the border, bringing devastation, the common folk faced their own daily battles that were no less dire for being mundane. Consider the plight of Hamish M'Leod, a crofter working a small strip of land on the estates of his clan chief. Each morning before dawn, he would wake to the sound of his wife Margaret grinding oats for the day's porridge, the rhythmic scraping of stone against stone, a familiar soundtrack to their existence. Their single-room dwelling, shared with a cow and several chickens for warmth, was perpetually damp from the highland mists that seemed to seep through every crack in the stone walls. The soil Hamish worked was thin and rocky, grudgingly yielding crops of oats and barley that formed the backbone of their diet. A good harvest might see the family through the winter months, but a poor one meant watching their children's faces grow gaunt with hunger as the stores dwindled. The specter of famine was never far away, and when it struck, entire communities could be reduced to eating grass, bark, and whatever roots they could dig from the frozen ground. Even in times of relative plenty, the quality of food available to peasants like Hamish was poor by any standard. Bread was often made from inferior grains mixed with whatever fillers could be found. Ground acorns, peas, or even sawdust when times were particularly desperate. The resulting loaves were dense, gritty affairs that could break teeth and provided little nourishment. Meat was a rare luxury. Perhaps a bit of salted pork at Christmas, or when an animal died of natural causes. The preparation and storage of food presented constant challenges in an age without refrigeration or proper preservation techniques. Grain had to be carefully protected from rats and moisture, yet storage facilities were primitive at best. Milk soured quickly, meat spoiled rapidly in warm weather, and even ale, the common drink of choice since water sources were often contaminated, could turn rancid if not consumed promptly. The very act of eating was fraught with danger in ways that would be unimaginable today. Contamination was rampant with livestock often kept in the same spaces where food was prepared and consumed. Flies buzzed constantly between animal waste and cooking pots, while vermin skewered through grain stores and kitchen areas. Food poisoning was common, and even nobles were not immune. King John of England himself died in 1216 after consuming spoiled peaches. Adding to these hardships were the religious restrictions imposed by the Catholic Church during Lent and on designated fast days throughout the year. Even the meager protein sources available to peasants were forbidden for families already subsisting on the edge of starvation. These additional dietary restrictions could push them over the brink. Margaret M'Leod would watch helplessly as her children grew weaker during the 40 days of Lent, knowing that their few precious eggs and strips of dried fish must be put away in observance of church law. The unscrupulous practices of food producers added another layer of misery to peasant life. Bakers regularly adulterated their bread with sawdust, chalk, or ground bones to stretch their supplies. Alewives watered down their brews to increase profits, leaving their customers with weak, unsatisfying drinks that provided little of the nutrition and calories they desperately needed. While laws existed to prevent such practices, enforcement was sporadic and often ineffective. Perhaps most tragic was the stark inequality that defined medieval Scottish society. While peasants like Hamish and Margaret scraped together meals of thin porridge and stale bread, the halls of their clan chiefs groaned under the weight of elaborate feasts. Roasted meats, exotic spices, fine wines, and delicate pastries graced the tables of the nobility, who consumed more in a single meal than a peasant family might see in a month. This disparity was not merely about quantity, but about the very nature of the food itself. Where peasants ate coarse, monotonous fare that left them malnourished and susceptible to disease, the wealthy enjoyed varied diets rich in proteins, fats, and the precious spices that could transform even simple ingredients into culinary delights. A pinch of cinnamon or cloves, worth more than a peasant's annual income, could elevate a dish from mere sustenance to genuine pleasure. The psychological toll of this constant food insecurity cannot be overstated. The knowledge that one's next meal was never guaranteed, that a failed harvest or a clan raid could mean starvation, created a perpetual state of anxiety that permeated every aspect of life. Parents went to bed hungry so their children could eat, and even then often had to watch helplessly as malnutrition stunted their offspring's growth and left them vulnerable to disease. Yet even in the face of such hardship, the human spirit endured. Peasant women like Margaret M'Leod developed remarkable ingenuity in making the most of limited resources. They learned to identify edible wild plants to preserve what little meat came their way through salting and smoking, and to stretch meager supplies through careful rationing and creative cooking. Community bonds were strengthened by shared adversity with neighbors, helping neighbors through the worst times and celebrating together when fortune smiled upon them. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural life provided some structure and hope amid the uncertainty. The arrival of spring brought the promise of new growth, while harvest time offered the possibility of abundance, however temporary. Even the humblest peasant could take pride in a well-tended garden or a successful batch of ale, finding moments of satisfaction in work well done, despite the harsh circumstances. As we reflect on the struggles of medieval Scottish peasants like Hamish and Margaret M'Leod, we are reminded of how far humanity has progressed in securing basic necessities. The abundance and variety of food available today, the safety standards that protect us from contamination, and the social systems that provide support in times of need. All these represent centuries of gradual improvement from those dark days when a full belly was a luxury and hunger was a constant companion. Their story serves as both a sobering reminder of the hardships our ancestors endured and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. In their daily struggles for survival, we see reflected the fundamental dignity of ordinary people who, despite having so little, found ways to create meaning, community, and hope in their lives. Looking at your script summary and the reference materials, I'll continue from where you left off, focusing on the social divides and legal structures that shaped medieval European society. Here's part 6. As we've witnessed the harsh realities of medieval life unfold before us, from the brutal justice system to the constant struggle for sustenance, we begin to see how these hardships carved deep divisions into the very fabric of society. The strange laws we've explored were not merely quirks of a bygone era, but tools that reinforced a rigid hierarchy where one's birth determined one's fate with merciless precision. Picture, if you will, a world where the accident of your birth could sentence you to a lifetime of backbreaking labor, while others enjoyed lives of leisure and abundance, simply because they emerged from the right womb. This was the reality of medieval Europe, where society was stratified into 3 distinct orders, each as separate as oil and water, yet bound together by invisible chains of obligation and dependence. At the pinnacle of this pyramid sat the nobility, those who fought and ruled. These were the lords and ladies who lived in stone castles that pierced the sky like monuments to power. Their days were filled with courtly pursuits, elaborate ceremonies, and the intricate dance of politics. They wore silk and velvet, dined on exotic delicacies, and spoke in refined tongues that marked them as clearly as any coat of arms. For them, the strange laws we've encountered were tools of control, weapons to be wielded against those beneath them. Below them, yet still elevated above the masses, stood the clergy, those who prayed. These men and women of God possessed a different kind of power, one that claimed dominion over souls rather than bodies. They lived in monasteries and cathedrals, surrounded by illuminated manuscripts and sacred relics. Their influence stretched into every corner of life, from the bedroom to the marketplace, dictating not just what people believed, but how they lived, ate, and even thought. And at the base of this structure, supporting the weight of the entire edifice on their bent backs, toiled the peasantry, those who worked. These were the vast majority of Europe's population, bound to the land like trees rooted in soil, unable to move or change their station without permission from their betters. They lived in hovels of mud and thatch, their hands perpetually stained with dirt, their backs permanently curved from endless labor. The legal system we've explored served to maintain these divisions with ruthless efficiency. The very concept of justice itself was different depending on which rung of the ladder you occupied. A noble who killed a peasant might pay a fine, while a peasant who stole bread could face the gallows. The trial by combat that seemed so absurd to our modern eyes made perfect sense in a world where physical prowess was seen as a divine gift, where God was believed to favor the righteous with strength and skill. Consider the tale of Sir Geoffrey de Montfort, a minor lord who found himself accused of murder by a peasant named Willem. The accusation was serious, the evidence compelling. Yet, when the matter came before the court, it was not witnesses or physical proof that would determine guilt or innocence. Instead, the 2 men faced each other in a circle of packed earth, armed with sword and shield, while nobles and commoners alike gathered to watch divine justice unfold. Willem, though strong from years of farm labor, had never held a sword in anger. His callous hands, so skilled with plow and scythe, fumbled with the unfamiliar weight of steel. Sir Geoffrey, trained from childhood in the arts of war, moved with the fluid grace of a born killer. The outcome was never truly in doubt. When Willem fell, his blood seeping into the earth he had worked all his life, the crowd nodded in satisfaction. God had spoken. Justice had been served. But this was justice only in the eyes of those who crafted the system. To the peasants watching their champion die, it was yet another reminder of their powerlessness, another demonstration that the law existed not to protect them, but to keep them in their place. The strange laws of medieval Europe were not bugs in the system. They were features carefully designed to preserve a social order that benefited the few at the expense of the many. This rigid hierarchy extended beyond the courtroom into every aspect of daily life. Sanctuary laws dictated what each class could wear, ensuring that a glance was enough to determine someone's social status. A peasant caught wearing silk could be publicly whipped, while a merchant who dared to don the colors of nobility might find himself stripped of his wealth and status. These laws served as constant reminders that crossing the boundaries between classes was not just difficult, it was forbidden. The very food people ate was regulated by their station. While nobles feasted on exotic spices that cost more than a peasant's annual income, the common folk were often forbidden from hunting the game that roamed freely through their fields. Poaching a deer from the Lord's forest was not just theft. It was an assault on the natural order itself, punishable by death or mutilation. The irony was bitter. These animals might destroy a peasant's crops, leaving his family to face starvation, yet he could not touch them without risking his life. Marriage, too, was subject to the whims of the social hierarchy. Peasants could not marry without their lord's permission, and that permission often came with a price. The right to choose one's own spouse, something we consider fundamental, was a luxury reserved for those with wealth and status. Young women might find themselves wed to strangers, their bodies and futures traded like commodities in deals that served their families' interests but ignored their own desires. Even death could not escape the grasp of social distinction. The wealthy were buried in elaborate tombs within consecrated ground, their souls speeded to heaven by paid prayers and costly masses. The poor were often dumped into unmarked graves, their passage to the afterlife dependent on the charity of others. In a world where the promise of heaven was often the only comfort available to the suffering masses, even this final hope was rationed according to one's ability to pay. The Church, despite its teachings of equality before God, was deeply complicit in maintaining these divisions. While Christ had preached that the meek would inherit the earth, his earthly representatives seemed more interested in ensuring that the meek remained meek. Bishops lived like princes, their palaces rivaling those of secular lords, while village priests struggled to maintain their authority over congregations who often knew as much scripture as they did. The doctrine of the three orders was not merely a social convenience. It was presented as divine will. Peasants were told that their suffering was part of God's plan, that their earthly toil would be rewarded in heaven, but only if they accepted their fate without complaint. Those who questioned this arrangement were not just rebels, they were heretics, challenging the very structure that God himself had ordained. Yet beneath the surface of this seemingly stable system, tensions simmered like water in a kettle. The same laws that maintained order also created the conditions for explosive rebellion. When people have nothing left to lose, when the law offers no protection and no hope for improvement, when justice becomes a mockery and mercy a foreign concept, desperation can transform the mess souls into revolutionaries. The strange laws of medieval Europe were not just historical curiosities. They were the instruments of oppression, the tools by which a small elite maintained control over the vast majority of the population. They remind us that law and justice are not the same thing, that legal systems can be crafted to serve power rather than truth, and that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would use the machinery of justice to grind the powerless beneath their heels. As we drift deeper into the realm of sleep, let these medieval shadows remind us of how far we have traveled from those dark days, yet how easily we might find ourselves walking similar paths if we forget the lessons written in the blood and tears of our ancestors. The strange laws of medieval Europe were not accidents of history. They were deliberate choices, and in understanding them, we better understand the fragility of the justice we too often take for granted. In the morning light, when consciousness returns, perhaps we will carry with us a deeper appreciation for the rights and freedoms that countless generations fought and died to secure. For in the end, the true strangeness of medieval law was not its brutality or its absurdity, but its reminder that justice is not a given. It is a gift that each generation must earn anew. Rest now and let the whispers of history carry you toward dreams where the scales of justice are balanced not by the weight of gold or the strength of arms, but by the simple recognition that all souls, regardless of birth or station, deserve dignity, compassion, and the chance to live free from the strange and terrible laws that once held our ancestors in chains. As the golden hour light filters through the barred windows of a medieval manor house, casting long shadows across the cold stone floors, we find ourselves transported to a world where justice was not blind, but rather deeply entrenched in the rigid social hierarchy that defined every aspect of life. Tonight, we continue our gentle journey through the peculiar and often harsh legal landscape of medieval Europe, where the law served not as an equalizer, but as a powerful tool to maintain the vast chasm between the noble and the common. The medieval legal system was a complex web of overlapping jurisdictions and competing authorities, each with their own interpretation of justice. At the highest level sat the king's courts, dispensing royal justice with ceremonies that bordered on the theatrical. Below them operated the ecclesiastical courts of the church, wielding both spiritual and temporal power over matters of morality and faith. And scattered throughout the countryside were the manor courts, where local lords held sway over their peasants with an authority that was both absolute and arbitrary. But perhaps nowhere was the inequality of medieval justice more apparent than in the concept of Vergild, the ancient Germanic practice of assigning monetary values to human lives based on social status. Under this system, the life of a nobleman might be worth 30 times that of a common peasant, and these valuations were not merely symbolic, but formed the basis for legal compensation in cases of murder or injury. A lord who killed a serf might pay a few silver coins to the victim's family, while a peasant who dared raise a hand against nobility faced execution without question. The courts themselves reflected this stark social divide in their very architecture and procedure. When a nobleman appeared before a judge, he was afforded elaborate ceremony, comfortable seating, and the presumption of honesty that came with his elevated station. His word carried weight simply by virtue of his birth, and his testimony was rarely questioned unless contradicted by someone of equal or higher rank. The proceedings moved at a dignified pace with careful attention paid to precedent and proper legal form. How different was the experience for a common peasant dragged before the same tribunal. These unfortunate souls were herded into drafty, uncomfortable spaces, forced to stand throughout lengthy proceedings that they often could not understand, due to the use of Latin or French legal terminology. Their own testimony was viewed with suspicion, requiring multiple witnesses or the support of their betters to carry any credibility. The very clothes they wore marked them as inferior. Their rough homespun garments, a stark contrast to the fine silks and furs of their social superiors. The punishments meted out by these courts further reinforced the social order through their deliberate inequality. When a nobleman was convicted of a crime, he might face exile, the loss of lands, or at worst, a swift execution by sword, a death considered honorable and befitting his station. The wealthy could often purchase pardons or commute their sentences through substantial payments to the crown, transforming justice into yet another commodity available only to those with means. For the common people, however, punishment was designed to be both severe and publicly humiliating. The stocks and pillory were favorite devices for minor infractions, forcing the guilty to endure not only physical discomfort, but the jeers and abuse of their neighbors. More serious crimes brought flogging, branding, or the loss of limbs, punishments that left permanent marks of shame upon the survivor. The gallows were reserved for the most heinous offenses. But even here, class distinctions persisted. While nobles were granted the mercy of a quick death, commoners often faced the slow strangulation of hanging or the prolonged agony of more elaborate execution methods. The legal proceedings themselves were often elaborate performances, designed as much to reinforce social hierarchy as to determine guilt or innocence. Trial by ordeal remained a common practice well into the medieval period, based on the belief that divine intervention would protect the innocent from harm. These orals took many forms, each more terrifying than the last for those forced to endure them. The ordeal of hot iron required the accused to carry a piece of red-hot metal for a prescribed distance, usually 9 steps before having their hands bandaged and examined 3 days later. If the wounds showed signs of healing, they were declared innocent. If infection had set in, guilt was assumed. The ordeal of boiling water demanded that the accused plunge their hand into a cauldron of bubbling liquid to retrieve a stone or ring from the bottom. Again, the condition of their flesh after 3 days would determine their fate. Perhaps most chilling was the ordeal of cold water, where the accused was bound and thrown into a pond or river. If they sank, they were considered innocent, but often drowned in the process. If they floated, it was taken as proof that the water as God's creation had rejected them, confirming their guilt and condemning them to death. The cruel irony was that survival itself became evidence of wrongdoing. These orals were not applied equally across society. Nobles and clergy could often avoid them entirely through their connections and influence or substitute monetary payments in their place. When members of the upper classes were subjected to orals, they were frequently allowed to nominate champions to undergo the trial on their behalf. While peasants had no such luxury and faced these terrifying tests with their own flesh and blood, The Church played a particularly complex role in medieval justice, simultaneously offering sanctuary to some while condemning others to horrific fates. Ecclesiastical courts handled matters of moral transgression, heresy, and witchcraft with a zeal that often bordered on the fanatical. The Inquisition, that most dreaded of church institutions, wielded techniques of interrogation and torture that were refined to extract confessions from even the most innocent defendants. Women, particularly those of lower social standing, were especially vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. A widow with property that neighbors coveted, a healer whose remedies seemed too effective, or simply an elderly woman with a sharp tongue might find herself dragged before church authorities on charges of consorting with devils. The trials that followed were elaborate theater designed to confirm predetermined guilt rather than seek truth. The accused witch faced an impossible situation. If she confessed immediately, she confirmed her guilt and faced burning at the stake. If she maintained her innocence, she was subjected to increasingly severe torture until pain forced her to admit to crimes she had never committed. The methods employed were both ingenious and horrifying. The strapardo, which dislocated shoulders and arms, the rack, which stretched bodies until joints separated, and the thumb screws, which crushed fingers with excruciating precision. Even the search for evidence of witchcraft reflected the biases of the age. The famous devil's marks that inquisitors sought on accused women's bodies were often nothing more than birthmarks, scars, or moles that any person might possess. Yet when found on a wealthy merchant's wife, such marks might be dismissed as natural imperfections, while the same blemishes on a peasant woman became irrefutable proof of supernatural corruption. The treatment of accused witches during imprisonment further demonstrated the class-based nature of medieval justice. Noble women accused of sorcery were often confined in relative comfort, provided with adequate food and clothing while awaiting trial. They might receive visits from family members and spiritual advisors, and their interrogations proceeded with at least the pretense of legal procedure. Common women, however, were thrown into dank, rat-infested dungeons where they faced deliberate deprivation designed to weaken their resistance. They were stripped of their clothing and forced to endure cold hunger and the constant threat of sexual assault by their jailers. The psychological torture of isolation and uncertainty was often as effective as any physical abuse in breaking down their defenses. The very language used in legal proceedings reinforced social hierarchies in subtle but powerful ways. When nobles appeared in court, they were addressed with elaborate titles and honorifics that emphasized their elevated status. Their crimes, when acknowledged at all, were described in euphemistic terms that minimized their severity. A nobleman who murdered a peasant might be said to have acted in righteous anger or to have corrected an insolent servant, language that transformed cold-blooded killing into acceptable social discipline. Peasants, by contrast, found their actions described in the harshest possible terms. A hungry farmer who poached a rabbit from his lord's forest became a thief and violator of sacred property. A woman who spoke harshly to her betters was transformed into a disturber of the peace and challenger of divine order. This linguistic manipulation served to justify the severe punishments that inevitably followed, making extreme penalties seem not only appropriate but necessary for the preservation of social stability. The concept of legal representation, so fundamental to our modern understanding of justice, was virtually unknown for the common people of medieval Europe. While wealthy defendants could employ learned advocates to argue their cases and navigate the complexities of legal procedure, peasants faced the intimidating machinery of justice entirely alone. They were expected to understand Latin legal terminology, comprehend arcane procedural requirements, and present coherent defenses despite having no education or training in such matters. This disparity in legal resources often determined outcomes before trials even began. A skilled advocate could find procedural grounds to dismiss charges, locate witnesses to provide alibis, or present alternative interpretations of evidence that cast doubt on their client's guilt. The unrepresented defendant, meanwhile, stumbled through proceedings they could barely comprehend, often inadvertently confirming their own guilt through ignorance of proper legal responses. The keeping of legal records further advantaged the wealthy while disadvantaging the poor. Nobles maintained extensive documentation of their rights, properties, and legal precedents, creating paper trails that could support their claims in court. They employed scribes and clerks to ensure that favorable judgments were properly recorded and preserved for future reference. These documents became powerful weapons in legal battles, providing evidence of ancient privileges and establishing patterns of precedent that favored their interests. Peasants, being largely illiterate and unable to afford scribal services, left little documentary evidence of their legal affairs. Their rights, such as they were, existed primarily in oral tradition and customary practice, making them vulnerable to challenges by those with written proof to support their claims. A nobleman with a properly documented deed could easily dispossess a peasant family that had worked the same land for generations, leaving them with no recourse and no means to prove their traditional rights. The corruption that pervaded medieval legal systems was both systematic and openly acknowledged. Judges and court officials expected regular payments from those seeking favorable treatment, and these bribes were so commonplace that they had acquired their own elaborate etiquette and customary rates. A wealthy defendant could essentially purchase not only favorable verdicts, but also the procedural advantages that made such outcomes possible. For the poor, however, even small bribes represented impossible expenses. A peasant family's entire annual income might not equal the cost of a minor court favor, leaving them entirely dependent on the supposed impartiality of officials who had long since abandoned any pretense of equal treatment. The result was a justice system that operated as a marketplace where legal outcomes were bought and sold like any other commodity. The physical conditions of medieval prisons reflected these same class distinctions with brutal clarity. Wealthy prisoners could purchase comfortable accommodations, adequate food, and even the services of personal servants during their confinement. They might occupy private chambers with windows, furniture, and the freedom to receive visitors and conduct business. Some noble prisoners lived better in jail than many free peasants did in their own homes. Common criminals, however, were herded into overcrowded, disease-ridden dungeons where death from illness was more likely than eventual release. They received minimal food of the poorest quality, often crawling with vermin and barely sufficient to sustain life. No medical care was provided for the sick or injured, and the strong preyed upon the weak in an environment where guards turned blind eyes to violence among their charges. These disparities in treatment extended even to the moment of execution. Noble criminals who faced death were granted elaborate final ceremonies that honored their rank even as their lives were forfeit. They might be allowed final speeches, visits from clergy of their choosing, and executions carried out with swift, merciful methods that minimize suffering. Their bodies were often returned to their families for proper burial in consecrated ground. Common criminals faced death as they had faced life without dignity or consideration for their humanity. They were marched to execution sites amid jeering crowds, denied final words or spiritual comfort, and killed by methods deliberately chosen for their cruelty and public spectacle. Their bodies were often left to rot on gibbets as warnings to others, denied even the basic dignity of proper burial. As we drift deeper into the realm of sleep, let us reflect on this complex tapestry of medieval justice where law served not as a protection for the innocent, but as a tool for maintaining the rigid social order that defined every aspect of existence. In this world, birth determined not only one's station in life, but also the very nature of justice one could expect to receive. The wealthy lived in a realm where law was malleable, where influence in gold could reshape reality itself and transform the guilty into the innocent. They enjoyed the protection of elaborate procedures, skilled advocates, and sympathetic judges who understood that true justice meant preserving the natural order that placed them at society's apex. The poor, meanwhile, inhabited a darker realm where law was an instrument of oppression rather than protection, where guilt was often predetermined by social status, and where survival depended more on luck than on any abstract concept of justice. They faced a system designed not to determine truth, but to confirm their subordinate position and remind them of their powerlessness in the face of their better's authority. Yet, even in this harsh landscape, we can glimpse the seeds of change that would eventually transform these primitive systems into something approaching true justice. The very extremes of medieval legal inequality would eventually provoke reactions that led to demands for reform, due process, and equal treatment under law. The struggles of these forgotten peasants and their suffering under arbitrary authority helped forge the principles that we now take for granted in our modern legal systems. As you settle into peaceful slumber, perhaps you might dream of a world where justice truly was blind, where birth and wealth held no sway over legal outcomes, and where every person, regardless of station, could expect fair treatment under law. It is a vision that those medieval peasants suffering under their lord's arbitrary justice could scarcely have imagined, yet their struggles helped make it possible. Rest, well knowing that the harsh lessons of medieval justice have not been forgotten, and that the principles of equality and fairness we cherish today were paid for with the suffering of countless generations who came before us. In their memory, we continue the eternal struggle to perfect justice and ensure that law serves not the powerful, but the cause of truth and human dignity. Looking at the context you've provided and the reference materials, I'll continue from where it left off, focusing on the increasingly complex and often arbitrary nature of medieval laws that governed every aspect of daily life. Beyond the spectacle of trials by ordeal and the peculiar justice meted out to animals, medieval Europe was governed by an intricate web of laws that touched every moment of a person's existence. These regulations weren't merely suggestions or guidelines. They were rigid commandments that dictated how one dressed, where one could walk, what one could eat, and even how one could express grief. Consider the sumptu laws that swept across medieval kingdoms like invisible chains binding society into its predetermined order. These weren't simply fashion guidelines. They were legal mandates that prescribed exactly what fabrics, colors, and styles each social class could wear. A peasant caught wearing silk could face heavy fines or public humiliation. The rich purple dyes extracted from murex shells were reserved exclusively for royalty, while certain shades of red remained the privilege of the nobility alone. In the 14th century England, these clothing laws reached absurd levels of specificity. Servants were forbidden from wearing cloth worth more than 2 marks per yard. Merchants, despite their growing wealth, could not don the furs and jeweled accessories of the aristocracy. Even the length of one's shoes was regulated. The pointed poulaines favored by fashionable men could only extend so many inches beyond the toe, with a measurement varying according to one's rank. These laws created a society where a glance could instantly reveal a person's place in the social hierarchy. But they also created a peculiar form of legal theater where enforcement was sporadic and often depended more on local prejudices than consistent application. A wealthy merchant might bribe his way into wearing forbidden silks, while a poor craftsman could face severe punishment for the slightest transgression. The regulation of trade and commerce produced equally bizarre legal scenarios. Market laws in medieval towns could be bewilderingly complex. In some German cities, bakers were required to attach their personal seal to every loaf, making them legally responsible for its weight and quality. Shortchanging customers wasn't just bad business. It was a criminal offense that could result in the baker being dragged through the streets in a cart, pelted with his own inferior bread. Wine merchants faced their own peculiar legal challenges. In Paris, wine could only be sold during certain hours and only in designated areas. The quality was monitored by official wine tasters whose verdicts carried the force of law. Poor wine wasn't just returned, it was publicly destroyed, and the merchant faced fines that could bankrupt his business. Perhaps most telling were the laws governing movement and residence. In many regions, peasants were legally bound to the land, unable to leave their lord's estate without permission. But even among the free population, mobility was heavily regulated. Strangers arriving in a town had to register with local authorities and could be expelled at any time without cause. Travel required documentation, and those found on the roads without proper papers could be arrested as vagabonds or, worse, suspected of being outlaws. The enforcement of these movement laws created a society of constant surveillance. Neighbors were expected to report strangers, and communities developed elaborate systems of mutual monitoring. In England, the system of frank pledge made every freeman responsible for the behavior of his neighbors. If one member of a tithing committed a crime and fled, the remaining members could be held financially liable. These legal obligations extended into the most private spheres of life. Marriage laws didn't just govern the ceremony, they regulated courtship, dictated appropriate behavior between spouses, and even prescribed how couples should conduct themselves in their own homes. In some regions, public displays of affection were legally restricted with kissing. In public spaces, punishable by fines, the legal regulation of death was equally intricate. Mourning periods were prescribed by law with specific requirements for clothing, behavior, and the duration of grief. Widows in particular faced elaborate legal restrictions on their conduct, dress, and social interactions. The very expression of sorrow was subject to legal oversight, as excessive mourning could be seen as a challenge to divine will. Even the preparation and consumption of food fell under legal scrutiny. Beyond the church's religious restrictions, secular laws governed everything from the spices that could be used to the hours when certain foods could be prepared. In some Italian cities, the making of pasta was regulated by guild laws that specified not just ingredients and techniques, but who could legally call themselves a pasta maker. These culinary laws often reflected deeper social anxieties about luxury and excess. Sumptuary laws didn't just govern clothing, they extended to food, limiting the number of courses that could be served at different social levels and restricting access to expensive ingredients. A merchant's feast, no matter how wealthy he had become, could not legally match the extravagance of a noble's table. The arbitrariness of these laws was often their most striking feature. Local customs could override royal decrees, creating a patchwork of regulations that varied from town to town. What was legal in one jurisdiction could be a serious crime just a few miles away. Travelers had to navigate not just physical dangers, but legal minefields where ignorance of local customs provided no protection from punishment. This legal complexity created opportunities for both corruption and creativity. Wealthy individuals learned to manipulate the system, using their resources to obtain exemptions or to ensure favorable interpretations of ambiguous laws. The poor, lacking such options, often found themselves trapped by regulations they barely understood, facing punishments that seemed to bear no relation to their supposed crimes. The medieval legal system's obsession with precedent and tradition meant that even obviously outdated laws remained in force for centuries. Ancient regulations governing long-vanished trades or addressing long-resolved conflicts continued to be enforced simply because they existed. This created a legal landscape where the past held tyrannical power over the present, where the dead hand of tradition could reach across centuries to punish the living. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these strange laws was how they shaped the medieval mind itself. Living under such constant legal scrutiny, medieval people developed an acute awareness of hierarchy, status, and proper behavior. The law wasn't just something that governed exceptional circumstances. It was a constant presence that shaped daily decisions and social interactions. This legal omnipresence created a society where rebellion took subtle forms. People learned to navigate the system through careful compliance, creative interpretation, and occasional calculated defiance. They developed elaborate social codes that allowed them to express individuality within rigid constraints, finding freedom in the spaces between the laws rather than in their absence. As we drift deeper into sleep, we can almost hear the distant echo of medieval life. The rustle of regulated garments, the measured steps of citizens carefully observing movement restrictions, the whispered consultations about which laws applied where. It was a world where the simple act of existing required constant legal navigation, where every choice carried potential consequences, and where the strange machinery of medieval justice ground on, shaping lives in ways both profound and absurd. These strange laws remind us that the past is indeed a foreign country, one where the rules that govern daily life seem almost incomprehensible to modern minds. Yet, in their very strangeness, they reveal something essential about the medieval world. Its desperate attempt to create order through regulation, to maintain stability through control, and to preserve hierarchy through the minute management of human behavior. Sleep well. knowing that in our modern world we no longer face imprisonment for wearing the wrong color or eating forbidden foods at the wrong hour. The strange laws of medieval Europe have faded into history, leaving us free to dream of simpler times when justice, however peculiar, was at least predictable in its very unpredictability. Looking at the script summary you've provided, here's part 9 of the strange laws of medieval Europe, History for Sleep. In the darkening twilight of medieval Europe, when the church bells had ceased their evening toll and the last merchants had shuttered their stalls, another set of laws came into effect. These were the laws of the night, stranger and more severe than anything the daylight hours could conjure. As we settle deeper into our exploration of medieval jurisprudence, let us examine how darkness itself became a legal entity, transforming ordinary citizens into potential criminals simply by virtue of being awake when the sun had set. The concept of curfew from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire, was far more than a simple instruction to bank one's hearth. It was a comprehensive legal framework that governed every aspect of nocturnal life. When the curfew bell rang, typically at sunset or shortly thereafter, all fires were to be extinguished, all doors barred, and all honest citizens were expected to retire to their homes. To be found wandering the streets after curfew without proper authorization was itself a crime, punishable by fine, imprisonment, or worse. Yet the definition of proper authorization varied wildly from place to place, creating a labyrinthine system of nocturnal permissions that could trap the unwary. In London, a citizen might carry a lantern as proof of legitimate business. But in Paris, the same lantern could be viewed with suspicion, as only thieves and cutthroats had need of artificial light in the honest darkness. Some towns required written passes from local magistrates, while others demanded the accompaniment of a recognized citizen of a good standing. The complexity of these requirements meant that travelers in particular found themselves at constant risk of legal entanglement. The enforcement of curfew laws fell to the night watch, a peculiar institution that embodied many of the contradictions inherent in medieval justice. These men, often volunteers or conscripts from the local population, were charged with maintaining order during the most lawless hours. Yet they themselves operated in a legal gray area, wielding authority that was both absolute and tenuous. A watchman could detain, question, and even arrest citizens, but his actions were subject to review by daylight authorities who might have little sympathy for the challenges of nocturnal law enforcement. Consider the case of Thomas Brightwell, a baker from York, who ran afoul of these nighttime regulations in the winter of 1348. Thomas had risen before dawn, as was his custom, to begin preparing the day's bread. The ovens needed time to heat, and the dough required hours of careful attention. Yet, when he stepped outside to gather wood for his fires, he was immediately seized by the night watch, who accused him of violating curfew. Despite his protest that he was engaged in legitimate trade, Thomas found himself dragged before the bailiff at first light. The bailiff faced a dilemma that perfectly illustrated the absurdities of medieval law. On one hand, Thomas had clearly violated the letter of the curfew ordinance by being abroad before dawn. On the other hand, his profession required him to begin work while darkness still reigned, and the town depended on his bread for daily sustenance. The solution, typical of medieval jurisprudence, was both ingenious and bizarre. Thomas was fined for his violation, but granted a special license to be abroad before dawn, provided he carried a blessed candle from the church and recited 3 Hail Marys if challenged by the watch. This case reveals another peculiar aspect of medieval law, the belief that legal violations could be ameliorated through religious observance. Many nocturnal ordinances included provisions for spiritual remediation, as if the act of prayer could somehow neutralize the legal contamination of being abroad after dark. Pilgrims, for instance, were often granted immunity from curfew laws, not because their travel served any practical purpose, but because their spiritual mission was deemed to purify their nocturnal wanderings. The gendered nature of nighttime laws created additional layers of complexity and injustice. Women found abroad after dark faced not only the standard penalties for curfew violation, but also assumptions about their moral character and professional activities. A woman walking alone at night was automatically suspect regardless of her actual business or destination. The law presumed that honest women had no legitimate reason to be abroad in darkness, and this presumption carried severe consequences. Margaret Kemp, the famous mystic and author, documented several encounters with night watch authorities who refused to believe that a woman could be traveling for religious purposes after dark. Her writings describe the humiliation of being questioned, searched, and detained simply for attempting to reach early morning prayers at distant churches. Despite carrying letters from bishops and abbots attesting to her pious intentions, Margaret was repeatedly treated as a suspected prostitute or thief, illustrating how legal presumptions could override even the highest religious authorities. The punishment for nocturnal violations often reflected the medieval obsession with public humiliation as a deterrent. Those caught breaking curfew might find themselves sentenced to spend the following night in the stocks, publicly displayed as examples of law-breaking. Others were required to carry lanterns through the town for a specified period, essentially marking themselves as former curfew violators. These penalties served the dual purpose of punishment and advertisement, warning other citizens of the consequences of nocturnal transgression. Yet perhaps the strangest aspect of nighttime law was its interaction with the medieval understanding of time itself. Without reliable clocks, the precise moment when curfew began was often a matter of dispute. Different authorities might use different markers. The ringing of church bells, the position of stars, or simply the subjective judgment of the watch. This temporal ambiguity created endless opportunities for legal challenges and appeals, as defendants argued that they had been arrested before curfew officially began or that the timing of the curfew bell had been irregular. The town of Canterbury developed an elaborate system to address these temporal disputes, employing an official timekeeper whose sole responsibility was to ring the curfew bell at the precise moment when day became night. This position, known as the bellman of hours, was considered so crucial to the administration of justice that the holder was exempt from taxation and granted a house near the cathedral. Yet, even this innovation failed to eliminate controversy as debates raged about whether the curfew began when the bell started ringing or when it finished, and whether a particularly long or short series of chimes could affect the legal validity of subsequent arrests. The intersection of curfew law with the medieval guild system created additional complications that seem almost satirical in their complexity. Different trades were granted different exemptions and restrictions based on arcane calculations of social utility and moral worth. Physicians were generally permitted to travel at night, but only when summoned to attend the sick, and only if they carried specific tokens proving their professional status. Midwives enjoyed similar privileges, but faced strict requirements about the routes they could take and the companions they could bring. Brewers and bakers, whose work often required nocturnal activity, found themselves in a constant state of legal uncertainty. While their trades were essential to community welfare, their night work was viewed with suspicion by authorities who associated darkness with moral corruption. The solution was typically a complex system of licenses, bonds, and surveillance that transformed honest tradesmen into quasi-criminals, requiring constant legal supervision. The enforcement of these nighttime regulations revealed the deep social tensions underlying medieval society. The night watch, drawn primarily from the middling classes, often found themselves policing their social superiors and inferiors with equal rigor. A wealthy merchant caught abroad after curfew might attempt to invoke his social status, while a poor laborer could only plead necessity. The watchman, lacking clear guidance on how to navigate these social hierarchies, often made decisions that pleased no one and satisfied no standard of justice. Records from the city of Bristol describe a particularly telling incident from 1402, when the night watch encountered a group of young nobles returning from a feast at the castle. The nobles, emboldened by wine and social privilege, refused to halt when challenged and proceeded to beat several watchmen who attempted to detain them. The resulting legal proceedings dragged on for months as the city authorities struggled to balance the demands of law enforcement against the political reality of noble privilege. The case was eventually resolved through a face-saving compromise that satisfied neither justice nor logic. The nobles were required to pay compensation to the injured watchmen, but were not charged with assault. Instead, they were found guilty of the lesser offense of disturbing the peace of the night, which carried a fine but no imprisonment. The watchmen, meanwhile, were censured for excessive zeal in attempting to detain their social superiors, effectively criminalizing them for doing their appointed duty. This incident illustrates how medieval law often functioned not as an impartial system of justice, but as a complex negotiation between competing social and political forces. The law was simultaneously absolute and negotiable, sacred and pragmatic, creating a legal environment where outcomes depended as much on social status and political connections as on the facts of any particular case. The religious dimensions of nighttime law added yet another layer of complexity to an already convoluted system. The Catholic Church maintained that darkness was the domain of evil spirits and demonic forces, making nocturnal activity inherently suspect from a theological perspective. This belief influenced secular law, creating penalties that were both legal and spiritual in nature. Those caught abroad after dark might find themselves sentenced not only to fines or imprisonment, but also to specific forms of penance designed to cleanse them of spiritual contamination. The monastery of St. Albans developed an elaborate ritual for dealing with curfew violators who claimed religious motivation for their nocturnal wanderings. Such individuals were required to spend 3 nights in the monastery's chapel, maintaining a vigil while reciting prescribed prayers. Only after completing this spiritual cleansing could they return to normal legal status. This practice reflected the medieval belief that law and religion were inseparable and that legal violations carried spiritual consequences requiring religious remediation. As winter deepened and the hours of darkness stretched longer, The burden of curfew laws became increasingly onerous for ordinary citizens. The simple tasks of daily life, from drawing water to tending animals, became potential crimes when performed in darkness. Yet the alternative, attempting to complete all necessary tasks during the brief daylight hours, was often impossible for working people whose livelihoods depended on early starts and late finishes. The legal system's response to this practical reality was typically medieval in its combination of rigidity and arbitrary flexibility. Rather than reforming the laws to reflect actual human needs, authorities created an ever-expanding system of exceptions, exemptions, and special cases. Each exception required its own documentation, its own procedures, and its own enforcement mechanisms, creating a bureaucratic labyrinth that was often more burdensome than the original regulations. These nighttime laws reveal, perhaps more clearly than any other aspect of medieval jurisprudence, the fundamental disconnect between legal theory and lived reality. The lawmakers, typically drawn from the clerical and noble classes, created regulations based on idealized notions of how society should function, with little regard for the practical necessities of daily life. The result was a legal system that criminalized normal human behavior while failing to address the genuine problems it was ostensibly designed to solve. Yet for all their absurdity and injustice, these nocturnal regulations served important functions in medieval society. They provided a framework for social control that extended the reach of authority beyond the daylight hours. They reinforced social hierarchies by creating different rules for different classes, and they offered a sense of security to citizens who feared the genuine dangers that darkness could conceal. As we drift towards sleep ourselves, we might reflect on how these ancient laws of darkness continue to echo in our own legal systems. The assumption that honest citizens have no business abroad at certain hours, the belief that darkness itself is somehow morally corrupting, the use of time-based restrictions to control behavior. All these medieval concepts persist in various forms in contemporary law. The next time you venture out after dark, consider the invisible legal framework that governs your movement. The streetlights that illuminate your path, the laws that protect your right to travel freely, the absence of arbitrary curfews and religious tests, all represent hard-won victories over the kind of nighttime tyranny that once gripped medieval Europe. In the soft embrace of evening, we can appreciate how far we have traveled from those dark ages when the setting sun brought not rest, but the heavy hand of medieval law. Looking at the extensive material you've provided on medieval European laws in the reference videos, I'll craft Part 10 that continues the narrative while maintaining the soothing, sleep-focused tone. Here's the script. In the midst of all this legal chaos and social upheaval, one might wonder how ordinary people found any semblance of order in their daily lives. The answer lay not in the grand pronouncements of kings or the elaborate rituals of courts, but in the quiet, persistent traditions that governed the most intimate aspects of medieval existence: marriage, family, and inheritance. These were the pillars upon which medieval society truly rested. Yet even here, the strange laws of Europe cast their peculiar shadows. Marriage in medieval times was far from the romantic ideal we might imagine today. It was a legal contract often arranged by families and governed by a bewildering array of rules that varied not just from kingdom to kingdom, but from village to village. The Church insisted that marriage was a sacred sacrament requiring the free consent of both parties. Yet this noble principle was constantly undermined by the harsh realities of medieval life. Parents arranged marriages for children as young as 12, and consent was often assumed rather than freely given. Consider the strange case of marriage by capture, a practice that lingered in some remote corners of Europe well into the late medieval period. In certain regions of Scotland and Ireland, a man could legally claim a woman as his wife simply by abducting her and keeping her in his household for a year and a day. If she bore him a child during this time, the marriage was considered absolutely binding, regardless of her initial consent. This barbaric practice was justified by ancient customs that predated Christianity, yet it somehow persisted alongside the Church's teachings about holy matrimony. Even stranger were the laws governing marriage impediments, the reasons why a marriage might be forbidden or annulled. The Church maintained extensive lists of relationships that barred marriage, extending far beyond what we might consider reasonable. Cousins to the seventh degree were forbidden to marry, meaning that anyone who shared a great-great-great-great-great-grandparent was considered too closely related. In small medieval communities where everyone was related to everyone else in some distant way, finding a suitable spouse who wasn't technically a forbidden relative became a nearly impossible task. This led to the peculiar practice of purchasing dispensations, essentially buying permission from the Church to marry someone you weren't supposed to. The wealthy could afford these papal permits, but the poor were left to either live in sin or remain unmarried. It created a system where the fundamental human right to marry was determined not by love or compatibility, but by one's ability to navigate complex genealogies and pay ecclesiastical fees. The laws of inheritance were equally bizarre and often contradictory. In most of Europe, the principle of primogeniture meant that the eldest son inherited everything, leaving younger sons to fend for themselves. This created a class of landless nobles who often turned to warfare or the Church for survival. But the rules were never quite so simple. In some regions, inheritance was divided equally among all children. In others, daughters could inherit if there were no sons, and in a few places, the youngest son inherited everything based on the theory that older sons would have already been provided for. England's laws of inheritance included the notorious concept of bastardy, which created elaborate legal fiction around illegitimate children. A child born out of wedlock could never inherit, even if the parents later married. But there were exceptions and loopholes that kept lawyers busy for centuries. If parents married after a child's birth, and if the father formally acknowledged the child before witnesses, and if no legitimate heirs existed, then perhaps, just perhaps, the bastard might inherit something. These complex rules led to countless disputes and endless litigation. Women faced particular challenges under medieval inheritance law. Upon marriage, a woman's property typically passed to her husband's control under the legal principle known as cover. She essentially ceased to exist as a separate legal entity, becoming what the law termed a femme covert, a covered woman hidden under her husband's legal identity. Her property, her debts, even her crimes became his responsibility. She could not make contracts, file lawsuits, or write a will without his permission. Yet here, too, medieval law revealed its contradictory nature. Widows often enjoyed rights that married women were denied. A widow was entitled to her dére, typically 1/3 of her deceased husband's estate, which she could control independently. Some widows became powerful figures in their communities, running businesses and managing vast estates. The law recognized them as femmes seules, women alone, with nearly the same legal rights as men. It was a strange system that granted women more freedom in widowhood than they had ever enjoyed in marriage. The treatment of children under medieval law was equally complex and often harsh by modern standards. Children were considered miniature adults, subject to the same legal penalties as their elders. A child as young as 7 could be tried for theft and executed if found guilty. There was no concept of juvenile justice or rehabilitation. Children were expected to contribute to the family economy from an early age, and their labor was considered the property of their parents. Apprenticeship laws created a peculiar form of temporary slavery, where children as young as 10 or 12 were bound to masters for terms of 7 to 10 years. During this time they belonged entirely to their master, who could punish them, sell their services, or even bequeath them to another master in his will. The apprentice had no right to leave, no right to marry without permission, and no right to keep any wages they might earn. In return, they received food, shelter, and training in a trade if they survived the often brutal treatment. Perhaps nowhere were medieval laws stranger than in their treatment of family violence. Domestic violence was largely considered a private matter beyond the reach of royal or ecclesiastical law. A husband had the legal right to correct his wife with physical punishment, provided he didn't permanently maim or kill her. The law even specified the appropriate tools for such correction: a stick no thicker than a man's thumb, giving rise to the phrase rule of thumb. Children fared even worse. Parents had virtually unlimited authority over their offspring, including the right to sell them into servitude or apprenticeship. Infanticide, while technically illegal, was rarely prosecuted if the victim was a girl or if the family was desperately poor. The church condemned the practice, but local authorities often looked the other way, understanding the harsh realities of medieval life. Yet, even in these dark aspects of family law, we find glimpses of medieval society's attempts to protect the vulnerable. Some regions developed the custom of sanctuary marriage, where a woman fleeing an abusive husband could claim sanctuary in a church and petition for annulment. If she could prove that her husband had attempted to kill her, or that he was impotent, or that they were too closely related, she might gain her freedom. The law also recognized the concept of self-divorce in extreme circumstances. If a husband abandoned his wife for more than 7 years, or if he became a monk without her consent, she could remarry without formal annulment. These provisions offered a sliver of hope to women trapped in impossible situations, though they required considerable courage to invoke. Marriage contracts themselves could contain bizarre provisions that reflected the harsh realities of medieval life. Some contracts specified that the husband could not beat his wife more than once per week, or that he could not gamble away her dowry, or that he must provide her with a certain number of new dresses each year. These clauses reveal both the legal vulnerability of women and their families' attempts to protect them within the constraints of the system. The Church's involvement in marriage created its own peculiar complications. Priests were forbidden to marry, yet many maintained long-term relationships with women known as priests' wives or concubines. These relationships were technically illegal, but they were widely tolerated, and the children of such unions often inherited their father's property despite their illegitimate status. The Church periodically launched campaigns to enforce clerical celibacy. But these efforts were largely unsuccessful and often created more problems than they solved. Canon law, the Church's legal system, often conflicted with secular law, creating jurisdictional disputes that could drag on for decades. If a marriage dispute involved questions of consanguinity or spiritual relationships, it fell under church jurisdiction. But if it involved property or inheritance, it might be handled by royal courts. Clever litigants learned to frame their cases in ways that would bring them before the most favorable court, leading to endless appeals and jurisdictional challenges. The poor, as always, suffered most under these complex legal systems. They could not afford lawyers to navigate the intricacies of marriage law, nor could they pay for dispensations or appeals. They lived in a legal gray area, forming relationships and raising families according to local custom rather than formal law. Many couples lived together for years in what were called handfasting arrangements, temporary marriages that might or might not be formalized later. These informal arrangements were particularly common among the peasantry who could not afford elaborate wedding ceremonies or the fees required for formal registration. A couple might simply declare themselves married before witnesses, exchange simple vows, and begin living together. If they remained together for a year and a day, the law often recognized their union as valid, regardless of whether it had been formally blessed by a priest. As we drift deeper into the gentle embrace of sleep, let us reflect on these medieval attempts to regulate the most fundamental human relationships. For all their strangeness and occasional cruelty, these laws represented humanity's ongoing struggle to create order from chaos to protect the vulnerable while maintaining social stability. The medieval family, bound by laws both sacred and secular, was the foundation upon which all other social structures rested. In the quiet hours of the night, when castle walls echoed with the whispers of sleeping children and the soft breathing of married couples, the elaborate legal structures of the day seemed to fade away. What remained was the simple human need for companionship, for family, for belonging. The laws might be strange and often harsh, but they could not entirely suppress the fundamental human capacity for love, loyalty, and hope. And so these medieval families persevered, raising their children, tending their homes, and building the communities that would eventually grow into the modern world we know today. Their struggles with the complex laws governing marriage and family life remind us that the quest for justice and fairness is an ongoing human endeavor, one that continues to evolve with each passing generation. Rest well, dear listener, and know that the bonds of family and community that sustained our medieval ancestors continue to sustain us today, even as the laws that govern them continue to change and hopefully improve with the passage of time. As we close this exploration of medieval Europe's strange laws, we find ourselves at a crossroads between understanding the past and recognizing our present freedoms. The bizarre legal traditions we've examined, from animal trials to trial by ordeal, from sumptu laws to inheritance restrictions, reveal a world where justice was often arbitrary, where social status determined legal outcomes, and where the powerful crafted laws to maintain their dominance over the vulnerable. These medieval legal systems, for all their apparent strangeness to modern eyes, served specific purposes within their historical context. They reinforced social hierarchies, maintained religious authority, and attempted to preserve order in societies marked by uncertainty and upheaval. The elaborate rituals surrounding trials by combat or ordeal provided a sense of divine intervention in human affairs, while dress codes and trade regulations sought to maintain clear distinctions between social classes. Yet, beneath the surface of these legal frameworks lay deeper human truths that transcend the medieval period. The struggle for justice, the desire for fair treatment, and the tension between authority and individual freedom are themes that resonate across centuries. The medieval peasant who faced trial by ordeal shared the same fundamental human need for justice as any modern citizen navigating today's legal system. The corruption and inequality we've witnessed in these historical legal systems serve as powerful reminders of why the development of modern jurisprudence, with its emphasis on evidence-based proceedings, equal treatment under law, and protection of individual rights, represents such a significant advancement in human civilization. The arbitrary nature of medieval justice, where a lord's whim could determine life or death, underscores the precious nature of legal protections we now take for granted. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can find comfort in knowing that while the medieval world was often harsh and unpredictable, it was also populated by individuals who, despite the constraints of their time, sought meaning, justice, and dignity in their daily lives, their struggles and aspirations filtered through the strange lens of medieval law remind us that the human spirit's quest for fairness and freedom is indeed timeless. The strange laws of medieval Europe in all their bizarre complexity ultimately tell a story not just of the past, but of humanity's ongoing journey toward a more just and equitable world. In understanding where we came from, we better appreciate where we are, and perhaps gain wisdom for where we're going. Sleep well, knowing that the elaborate legal rituals and arbitrary judgments of the medieval world have given way to systems that, while imperfect, strive to treat all people with dignity and fairness under the law. As we reach the twilight of our medieval journey, we find ourselves confronting perhaps the most unsettling aspect of life in the Middle Ages, the complete absence of justice as we understand it today. The legal systems that governed medieval Europe were not designed to uncover truth or ensure fairness, but rather to maintain the rigid social order through spectacle, superstition, and the unwavering belief that God Himself would intervene to reveal guilt or innocence. Picture, if you will, a crowded village square on a gray autumn morning. The air is thick with tension as townspeople gather around a large wooden tub filled with murky water. At the center of this grim theater stands a trembling woman accused of poisoning her neighbor's well. Her fate will not be decided by evidence or testimony, but by whether she sinks or floats when bound and thrown into the water. This is trial by ordeal, and it represents the medieval mind's complete faith that divine justice would manifest through physical tests that we now recognize as nothing more than torture. The logic, such as it was, seemed unassailable to medieval thinkers. If God was all-knowing and all-powerful, surely He would not allow an innocent person to suffer unjustly. Therefore, any physical test that resulted in pain, injury, or death must indicate divine displeasure with the accused. The woman who floated was clearly being rejected by the sacred waters, proof of her guilt. The woman who sank, gasping and drowning, was being embraced by God's creation, evidence of her innocence. That she might die in the process of being proven innocent was merely an unfortunate side effect of divine justice. Trial by hot iron was equally barbaric in its simplicity. The accused would be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar for a prescribed distance, typically 9 paces. Their hand would then be bound and examined 3 days later. If the wound was healing cleanly, they were innocent. If it showed signs of infection or putrefaction, they were guilty. Of course, in an age without antiseptics or proper wound care, infection was almost inevitable, making this ordeal essentially a death sentence with extra steps. But perhaps no form of medieval justice was more revealing of the era's twisted priorities than trial by combat. When disputes arose between nobles or when a serious crime demanded resolution, the matter could be settled through armed combat between the accuser and the accused. The theory was that God would grant victory to the righteous party, ensuring that justice prevailed through strength of arms rather than strength of evidence. Imagine the absurdity of this system applied to modern crimes. A man accused of theft challenging his accuser to a duel with swords, with the assumption that whoever survived must be telling the truth. Yet this was considered not only acceptable, but divinely ordained in medieval society. The wealthy could hire professional champions to fight on their behalf, while the poor faced combat themselves or were forced to accept guilt rather than risk death in the lists. The case of Robert de Montfort illustrates the grim reality of trial by combat. In 1203, Robert was accused of murdering his business partner in a dispute over wool trading profits. Rather than face the ordeal of hot iron, he chose trial by combat against his accuser's brother, a skilled knight. The combat took place at dawn, in a field outside York, with the local lord presiding over the proceedings. Robert, a merchant with little training in warfare, was quickly overwhelmed by his opponent's superior skill and equipment. As he lay dying in the mud, his blood seeping into the earth, the assembled crowd nodded in satisfaction. God had spoken, and justice had been served. What makes these primitive legal systems even more disturbing is how they reinforce the brutal inequalities of medieval society. The wealthy could afford to hire champions or bribe officials. They had access to better equipment, training, and medical care that might help them survive, or the poor faced these trials with nothing but their failing bodies and desperate prayers. Consider the plight of Elena, a peasant woman accused of stealing grain from her lord's storehouse during a particularly harsh winter. Unable to afford a champion and too weak from malnutrition to survive trial by combat, she was subjected to trial by water. As the rough hemp rope cut into her wrists and ankles, as the freezing water closed over her head, Elena must have wondered what kind of God would design a system of justice that punished the innocent and rewarded the strong. The corruption inherent in these systems was breathtaking in its scope. Judges could be bribed to ensure that orals were conducted in ways that favored one party over another. The temperature of the iron could be adjusted, the depth of the water altered, the rules of combat modified to give advantage to the highest bidder. What was presented as divine will was often nothing more than human greed and manipulation, dressed up in religious clothing. Even when these trials were conducted with scrupulous attention to procedure, they remained fundamentally unjust. The underlying assumption that God would intervene in human affairs to reveal truth through physical suffering was not only theologically questionable, but practically absurd. Yet this assumption formed the bedrock of medieval legal thinking, creating a system where innocence was no protection against punishment and guilt could be hidden behind strength or wealth. The psychological impact of living under such a system cannot be overstated. Imagine the terror of knowing that a false accusation could lead to your death, not through any careful examination of facts, but through your ability to survive torture or defeat an armed opponent. The very randomness of these trials must have created a pervasive atmosphere of fear and helplessness among the common people. Women face particular disadvantages under these systems. In trial by combat, they were often required to find male champions to fight on their behalf, making their fate dependent on the skill and loyalty of others. In trials by ordeal, their generally smaller stature and weaker constitution made survival less likely. The medieval legal system was designed by men for men with little consideration for how its mechanisms might affect those already marginalized by society. The Church played a central role in legitimizing these barbaric practices. Priests would bless the instruments of ordeal, pray over the combatants, and interpret the results as manifestations of divine will. This religious sanction gave these trials an aura of sacred authority that made questioning them tantamount to questioning God Himself. The very institutions that claimed to represent mercy and compassion became the architects of a system that celebrated suffering and embraced brutality. Children were not exempt from this twisted justice. Young people accused of crimes might face modified orals supposedly appropriate to their age, but the underlying principle remained the same. Divine judgment through physical suffering was considered suitable for all members of society, regardless of their capacity to understand or defend themselves. The records that survive from medieval courts paint a picture of casual cruelty that is difficult to comprehend. Judges who ordered brutal punishments with the same detachment they might show when deciding what to have for dinner. Crowds who gathered to watch orals as entertainment, cheering when the accused survived and jeering when they didn't. A society that had convinced itself that torture was not only acceptable but necessary for the proper functioning of justice. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the way these systems crushed any possibility of redemption or rehabilitation. There was no concept of proportional punishment, no recognition that people might change or grow from their mistakes. The medieval legal system was interested only in punishment and spectacle, in maintaining order through fear rather than fostering genuine justice or social healing. The wealthy, of course, had ways to avoid these harsh realities. They could pay fines instead of facing orals, hire skilled lawyers to navigate legal technicalities, or simply use their influence to ensure that accusations never reach the point of formal trial. The medieval legal system was designed to terrorize the poor while protecting the privileged, creating a two-tiered system of justice that bore no resemblance to fairness or equity. As we reflect on these dark chapters of legal history, it becomes clear that the medieval approach to justice was symptomatic of a broader failure of imagination and compassion. A society that could convince itself that drowning innocent people was an acceptable way to determine guilt was a society that had lost touch with basic human dignity and rational thought. The legacy of these primitive legal systems extended far beyond the Middle Ages, influencing legal thinking and practice for centuries to come. The assumption that justice could be achieved through violence, that truth could be revealed through suffering, and that the powerful deserved different treatment than the poor would continue to shape legal systems long after trial by ordeal was officially abolished. Today, As we enjoy the protections of due process, the presumption of innocence, and the right to legal representation, it is worth remembering the countless individuals who suffered and died under medieval justice. Their pain was not meaningless if it serves to remind us of the precious nature of the legal protections we now take for granted, and the constant vigilance required to ensure that justice serves all members of society equally. The medieval legal system stands as a monument to human cruelty and irrationality, a reminder of how easily societies can convince themselves that barbarism is righteousness and that the will of God can be found in the screams of the innocent. In remembering these dark truths, we honor not only those who suffered, but also our own commitment to building a more just and compassionate world. And so, as the last echoes of medieval brutality fade into the gentle embrace of sleep, let us carry with us both the horror of what was and the hope of what might be. For in understanding the depths to which human societies can sink, we better appreciate the heights to which they might rise, and the endless work required to bend the arc of history toward justice.